New Chicago Bears defensive coordinator Dennis Allen is going to bring a very different style of defense to Chicago. And so today we're going to talk to Ross Jackson from Locked On Saints to get a sense for what made him such a good defensive coordinator in New Orleans, even when he did fail as a head coach.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1, and you can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. On the show today, we're going to learn all about Dennis Allen's defense. Again, Ross Jackson from Locked On Saints is going to join us. He's going to take us through the scheme, how he calls plays, what type of personnel he prefers, and where that lines up with what the Bears have versus what the Bears may still need to add to fit Dennis Allen's system. I think the most important thing we'll learn is that he's a little bit more of a rigid coach. Dennis Allen does things a certain way, and the Bears will need to meet that way for Dennis Allen. I think the theme of today is for better and for worse, but we're for much better for having had Ross Jackson join us on the podcast. He is one of my favorite people on the Locked On Podcast Network, and he's here with me in person in Mobile, Alabama, for a rare in-person Locked On Bears podcast interview. So let's bring in Ross Jackson and get to know more about Dennis Allen, and we'll also touch briefly on Bears offensive coordinator Declan Doyle, as well as one of the top candidates for the Bears offensive line coach position, who all also used to work for the New Orleans Saints. All right, we're joined now by host of Locked On Saints, Ross Jackson, in person in Mobile, Alabama, the rare in-person podcast interview. Of course, you can follow him on Twitter at Ross Jackson Nola. That's Nola. And Ross, Bears are making a little bit of New Orleans North on this coaching staff here. I know Ben Johnson wasn't a Saint, but he was part of this Saints coaching tree. Does it surprise you to see Dennis Allen go up, and now Declan Doyle was a Saints guy, and maybe the offensive line coach? I'm surprised to see these Sean Payton disciples go elsewhere, not with Sean Payton to New Orleans, but now forming another organization.
Yeah, it is really interesting because in New Orleans, the narrative very much is how people want to get away from the previous regime. Mm-hmm. Now you have the top head coach option in Canada out there, land with the Chicago Bears and say, you know what, I like that Sean Payton regime. And so it's a really interesting sort of dichotomy in terms of like what we're looking at in New Orleans, which is this organization that's trying to move away from that tree. Now all of a sudden that tree is showing up in the top guys, things. So now you have the New Orleans Saints South, New Orleans Saints West over in Denver, and now a little bit of a New Orleans Saints North coaching staff being built up there in Chicago.
Well, and Detroit too, I suppose. They kind of were the original, but too, Campbell kind of did his own path there. Maybe we'll start there though. Like, why has the push in New Orleans been to kind of get away from Sean Payton? I mean, he was successful for a long time, but why? I would think that they wanted to kind of keep that rolling and just pick up where he left off.
Yeah, I think the thing is that they did. They tried to keep it rolling and then it failed. That's just kind of the bottom line of it. That's not to say that it's going to fail in Chicago or that those coaches will fail elsewhere. But the collection of what they tried to kind of build the continuity post Sean Payton with didn't work. And so now the option is get away from it to see maybe if you can create something new by new perspectives, new ideas, new influence, all those other things. So it's really just a result of Dennis Allen being at the top of it and trying to maintain what Sean Payton did. I think Dennis Allen has proven now at this point with 2 head coaching stints that didn't go great that he is a fantastic coordinator, not so much ready to be a head coach.
Yeah, I wanted to get into that. We'll get into the defense in a minute here, but why didn't he work as a head coach in New Orleans?
Yeah, I think the big thing that didn't work out for him in New Orleans is the fact that he's kind of just this reserved, quiet guy, and he has a lot of rigidity. And I think when you have rigidity as a coordinator, that's one thing. But when you have rigidity at the top of an organization and you're not necessarily receiving and amplifying or receiving and utilizing the player feedback that you're getting, that creates a little bit of, division sometimes, right? It doesn't work well. And then there was the moment where, as a head coach, final game in 2023 up against the rival Atlanta Falcons, where Jameis Winston plunges into the end zone.
Oh, yeah.
Or
I
gives
forgot
the
about
ball to Jamal Williams to plunge into the end zone when they were already winning, and they kind of went out in this victory formation thing and everything like that. And then Dennis Allen apologized publicly to the Atlanta Falcons for what the players did, and that created a big-time division and rift in between. Like, go out there and stand by your players and then rip them a new one privately behind the scenes. Don't go out there and apologize on their behalf.
Yeah, I can see where the human management side of things is a little different.
Right.
Those are the head coach duties, not just
Yep.
defensive coordinator duties. What would you say his strengths were as a head coach? I mean, aside from the defense being pretty good, like were there aspects of that he did well? I'm thinking from a perspective of like what he'll mentor Ben Johnson on as a first-time head coach. He can go to Dennis and, well, Dennis, you really handled this well in New Orleans from a head coaching perspective.
Yeah, I think what Dennis Allen's tenure, and I'm not trying to be funny here, but I think that what Dennis Allen's tenure teaches Ben Johnson is kind of what to avoid in terms of the pitfalls of moving from coordinator to head coach. I think, for a little while they kind of tried to roll with the same offensive system as called by Pete Carmichael, who at the time was like the longest tenured offensive coordinator in the NFL because he didn't have to call plays. He didn't do anything. Sean Payton handled all of it.
Yeah.
And so I think that like a part of it was trying to give him the keys and then let him do it. Then they went and they switched over to this Shanahan run-heavy offense that didn't really work. And some of it was injury-related. Some of it was just like a lack of a counterpunch, which is often the case in these Shanahan offenses, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And he kind of just turned over the offense to that side and then just kind of went hands off on it. And I think maybe what you learn from that if you're Ben Johnson is, you have a really decorated defensive coordinator, so you can go hands off. But where you have the youth, otherwise, be a little bit more hands-on, be a little bit more involved, and be clear about what it is that you want, the direction that you want to go. I think that's maybe one of those things that he'll learn from Dennis Allen. It didn't go great for Dennis Allen, so it's not like, hey, I can teach you this because I did it really well. It's more like, hey, here's kind of what my pitfall was. And so if he's willing to acknowledge those things, I think that's where he becomes more kind of beneficial to Ben Johnson in that area. But I think the biggest thing is he gives Ben Johnson's fantastic offense and outstanding defense that will complement.
Yeah, I want to go more specifically into Dennis Allen's scheme a little bit and the kind of personnel and players that we'll go through. Coming up next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by Gametime, the best way to get tickets for all of your favorite live events. I have the Gametime app on my phone. I've been using it long before Gametime became part of the Locked On Podcast Network, and it's the best way that I buy tickets, whether it's going to concerts or sports games. I went to Bears games with Gametime, comedy shows, theater events, you name it. They've got it all on Gametime. If you wanted to go to a playoff game, it's a great way to get tickets for any of your favorite sports as well. What I love about Gametime is that you can see your view from your seat before you buy the tickets, panoramic seat views, so you know exactly what you're getting. And with Gametime, you can turn on their all-in pricing feature, and you'll know exactly how much you're going to pay without any of those added fees at the end of the checkout process that make your tickets cost way more than you thought they would. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create that account and redeem our code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. Lauren Cox here with Ross Jackson from Locked On Saints, also part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. He's giving us the scoop on new Bears defensive coordinator Dennis Allen. We'll touch a little bit on offensive coordinator Declan Doyle, who was in New Orleans for a little while, and some rumored offensive line coach candidate in there as well. But let's start with Dennis Allen's defensive scheme. In a nutshell, like say Bears fans never watched the Saints defense. Yeah. I think we know it's a 4-3, right? Mm-hmm. But like beyond that, what were some of the characteristics that stood out as like an identity on that side of the ball?
Yeah, a lot of edge setters at edge rusher as opposed to the speedy pass rusher type. So expect big physical kind of speed to power conversion type play on the defensive line, and then a lot of man coverage. This is a full-on press man system. It's going to be perfect for a guy like Jalen Johnson who loves to be physical, right? It's going to really, really kind of elevate what it is that he does. The one thing that you know you're going to get from a Dennis Allen defense is physical attacking play. And so slot corners involved as pass rushers and run defenders, big physical edge rushers.
Is that like the Cam Jordan mold?
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Exactly. The Cam Jordan mold. And then I would look at like the like the Marcus Davenport mold, which may mean something to you and may not, but
Sure.
6'5" plus 270 pounds plus, like those big son of a guns that are going to run you over to get to the quarterback. And then the man coverage that will take the first and second reads away to give those defensive linemen 4, 5, 6 seconds to get to the quarterback on second and third efforts. Don't expect to see a lot of the like slim, speedy, win with bend type edge rushers. Sure. You're going to see the big physical play.
What's the downside of that then from a coverage standpoint? I imagine like if you're in tight man-to-man coverage, you need good corners.
Yeah.
But then, if your pass rush doesn't get home in 2 seconds, like are they going to be able to hold up? Like you're taking away man coverage can take away the quick first thing, but the longer the play goes, you start playing backyard football, scramble drill. It's hard all the man coverage. Like is there a need for quicker pressure there, or what do you see the relationship as between the man coverage and the pass rush in the Dennis Allen defense?
Yeah, so everything really is about that marriage of rush and coverage, just as you described. But one of the things that they've struggled with is that covering a second time-ness that comes with that playground style of football. The fact of the matter is that no defense is great against mobile quarterbacks.
Yeah, and
right?
for 5-6 seconds into play, every defense has trouble. Yes.
Yeah. So what you're trying to do is create the marriage to where you can get that quarterback to maybe scramble and be caught by a second-level player and things like that. Dennis Allen's defenses in New Orleans lacked a lot of athleticism from a personnel standpoint, not from his standpoint, but from a personnel standpoint at the second level. More athleticism at the second level will help to cover up some of those things. Where when that quarterback does begin to scramble, if there's a Sam linebacker that can crash down, put a little bit of pressure, force them to throw it away, or potentially even get to them, keep that the scramble drill from picking up too many yards if the quarterback decides to tuck and run, so on and so forth. That's where I think the missing ingredient was in New Orleans quite a bit, because they were really smart physical linebackers, downhill guys, but not a lot of sideline-to-sideline guys in New Orleans. And so I think that's a place where he might be able to improve personnel-wise in this Chicago Bears defense if they can go and get him that talent, or if that talent's already in play.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, Tremaine Edmonds has that sideline-to-sideline, and TJ Edwards is more the downhill. So it'll be fun to see how those two play off each other. I want to touch on the interior of the defensive line. In Chicago, they started blurring the line between what was a nose tackle and what was a three technique. They had a lot of big three techniques, a lot of fast nose tackles, and it was kind of like everybody kind of plays both defensive tackle positions. And then as a result, sometimes you get two smaller guys in there and you couldn't stop the run, or sometimes you get two bigger guys in there and the pass rush wasn't there. I guess how interchangeable has the defensive line been for Dennis Allen? Do you see the bigger defensive ends kick inside a lot on pass rushing downs, or is it a lot more distinct, like all our nose tackles are 350 and all our three techniques are 290?
One of the big things that was an issue for New Orleans is that they lost that 350 guy. And so my hope for you and Bears fans is that
Andrew Billings, let's go.
Right, is that they keep hold of those big guys that can change. What you want to do is change the numbers on the interior, right?
Yeah.
You want one guy to take up two guys. You want one guy to take up three guys. And then create those one-on-one matchups on the other side. That's ideally what works for a Dennis Allen defense. There was years ago in New Orleans a defensive tackle named Malcolm Brown, who they ended up sending over to Jacksonville for a while. And Malcolm Brown was perfect for what it was that they wanted to do, because he changed the numbers on the interior and created those one-on-one opportunities for those edge defenders. And that's where you saw a really, really successful defensive line. So if they can mimic that, then I think that will work. The other thing that you'll see a lot of is on third downs, you'll see a lot of Okie fronts. So you'll see 3 down linemen, 2 linebackers sugaring A-gaps, and then 2 safeties or 2 DBs on the outside.
That's fun.
And so they'll put 7 on the line. They might all rush. They might all, 4 of them might drop back, and they might only rush 3. And so it creates a little bit of, that's where Dennis Allen gets really aggressive, is on those third downs. And so because of that, you're going to see multiple fronts, and you're going to see what they call the NASCAR packages, right? So of the 3 defensive ends instead of the 2 and 2 when it comes to ends and tackles.
I'm glad you mentioned the aggressiveness there. Like, I think the Bears had a reputation of being fairly conservative from a pass rush standpoint. I know Dennis Allen is no Brian Flores, but I guess how would you rate the, as far as blitzing goes? Is it only in like he's going to do it, but only in key situations? Is it early and often? What sort of range of spectrum of blitzing should we expect from him?
Yeah, expect him to be calculated approach. Expect him to take a calculated approach to blitzing that gets a little bit less calculated and a little bit more aggressive on third downs. That's really the thing, right? Like, he's not worried about trying to blitz you on first down.
Sure.
If it's not an obvious passing situation, he wants his numbers. He wants to be able to kind of keep the rush in front of him. Second down, he might dabble.
Depends on down distance, yeah.
But third down, expect him to send somebody. And that's where the slot corner in particular becomes really important, and you'll see like the safety stack over the slot corner, and you're like, oh, slot corner's coming.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But then sometimes that guy drops out, and then they send the linebacker up the middle and everything like that. So I think that's where you'll see the blitz attack really get more aggressive, is a calculated third down approach.
Did you see that vary at all by trust in his personnel, in the sense that, like, when your defensive line is strong, maybe you don't have to blitz as much, whereas when you feel like I'm not getting a pass rush from my 4, I feel like I need to blitz more? Or is it fairly consistent that, like, he just wants to blitz on those downs, not because he feels like he needs to, but because it's a schematic advantage to throw something different at the quarterback?
You can give Dennis Allen 11 NFL players. You can give Dennis Allen 11 you and me's, and he's going to do the exact same thing.
Hey, I've got a pretty good wingspan.
You got great reach. The best I can do is maybe blind somebody with my bald head, and that's kind of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or maybe I can talk them into handing me the football. You know, that might be the furthest that I can go. But it doesn't matter who's on the field. They can be between 8 and 80 years old. His defensive scheme is his defensive scheme. And so that's one of the things that you're going to watch never really shift, never really change, is Dennis Allen's going to do what it is that he is going to do. And so when you do your game plans every Friday, it's going to be the easiest thing for you to do over on the defensive side, because he's not going to change based on what the opposing offense is doing. He's going to do what he feels works.
For better and for worse in that regard?
For better or for worse.
I do want to get into a little bit of the for worse there, and then touch briefly on Declan Doyle from his time in New Orleans, and maybe a potential Saints offensive line coach coming to the Bears, as we continue our conversation with Ross Jackson from Locked On Saints here on the Locked On Bears podcast. The Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by PrizePicks, the better way to play daily fantasy sports. The big game is almost here, and there's no better way to make it even more exciting than with PrizePicks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With over 10 million members and billions in winnings awarded, PrizePicks makes it fun and simple to get in on the action. Here's how it works. You pick more or less on at least 2 players' projections, and if you're right, you could win up to 1,000 times your cash. PrizePicks even has a free pick for that big game, where one of the starting quarterbacks only needs to throw 1 yard to win. Pair that with one more correct pick, and you're cashing out right away. You can check out their promos tab for all sorts of great, super sweet winners for the big game lineups. If you got a lineup that can go 3 for 3, you can split up to $1 million in promo funds. Just download the PrizePicks app today and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. That's promo code LOCKEDONNFL for an instant $50 after you play your first $5, win or lose, at PrizePicks. Run your game. All right, continuing our conversation today with Ross Jackson from Locked On Saints, getting the scoop on new Bears coaches that were formerly New Orleans Saints coaches. We hinted at it a little bit there before the break, Ross. For better and for worse, Dennis Allen is going to play Dennis Allen defense. Yeah. I think everyone's reasonably excited about Dennis Allen being like, this is a good defensive coordinator hire, but where should we either have concerns or red flags, or just like keep an eye on this in case this might go wrong or be less than ideal?
Yeah. I think really it's that rigidity, right? Like, you know, I think about Vic Fangio, right? Vic Fangio, incredibly rigid about what he does on the defensive side of the football. Works great for him in Philadelphia, didn't work great for him at all in Miami, right? And so it's got to be sort of the marriage between scheme, system, personnel, right?
Yeah.
And execution on top of all that too. I think Dennis Allen is a fantastic defensive coordinator. Don't look at what he did as a head coach and say that is indicative of what he's done as a defensive coordinator. You look at 2017, 18, 19, 20, and what he did in New Orleans in 21. Those were really the key years of where the personnel matched the scheme, the system worked, the execution was there. That's the peak of what he has the ability to do. And so I think that the pitfalls really only come for him when those things don't synchronize. And so maybe the first year's rough, second year gets better, and in third year it takes off, whatever it might be. He requires patience to an extent while that gets built. But once it's there, it's there. The issue then becomes, how patient is the organization willing to be to maintain the personnel once the personnel is right? That's where things get a little bit out of sorts.
One other quick thing on Dennis Allen before we move on. I know the Bears, we don't know exactly what his defensive assistants are going to look like. Besides, they brought in Al Harris from the Cowboys. So I know coordinator's not in charge of all this, but how would you describe player development on defense in New Orleans? Like, position coaches obviously matter a lot more on this, I think. But, like, did you see a young guy get drafted in the later rounds and develop into a greater player, or was there a lot of times where like you kept waiting for younger guys to get better and maybe not quite got better, and you don't know, was that the coach or was it just not a very good player? But I guess overall, like, were defensive players developed well in Dennis Allen's defense?
Defensive backs in particular were developed incredibly well in New Orleans. Doesn't matter if these guys were first-round picks like Marshawn Lattimore, undrafted guys like Rico Payton, who you've never heard of, and some of these other things. Like these guys, and even like you look at a guy like Isaac Yiadom, who has been all around, right? Familiar, and obviously, and he went off after a year in New Orleans of basically being the next man up behind Marshawn Lattimore when he was dealing with his kind of litany of injuries throughout that year. Weird things like lacerated kidneys and stuff like that. He had strange injuries that year. But then he was able to go off and get a nice contract with the San Francisco 49ers, for instance, and stuff. And so, like, that's really the cornerback and safety spots are the spots where you really saw a lot of development. You saw a little bit of development, a little bit more development over on the defensive end spots. A guy like Carl Granderson came in as an undersized, as in light Wyoming pass rusher, and then got 2 more contracts with the team and is now the team's top edge rusher. You know what I mean? And so that's a place there. The one place that you didn't see a lot of development was the second level, was that linebacker spot. They benefited massively from landing Demario Davis in free agency in 2018. That went a long way for them, but that was about the magnanimous nature of the type of player that Demario Davis is. So that's the one place where maybe you saw development kind of not show up as much as you'd like to see.
Well, we know a lot about Dennis Allen, and from his time as head coach and defensive coordinator. New Bears offensive coordinator Declan Doyle, a lot more of an unknown name. Saints tight ends coach for a few years, Broncos tight ends coach under Sean Payton. It seems like most of what we know is that Sean Payton likes him, so that's not a bad endorsement. Most fans of any team don't even know their tight end coach's name. Do you have much? What do you have on Declan? Open-ended. What do you have on Declan Doyle?
Actually, he spent most of his time in New Orleans as an offensive assistant, and then became that tight ends coach when he went over to Denver. He had worked with the tight ends, but the Saints have had some solid tight end coaches throughout their time and everything. They just worked with Clancy Brown, former Bears.
And of course Dan Campbell.
Dan Campbell, of course, everything. And so, like, he got. I think the thing that's really impressive about Declan Doyle is that Declan Doyle came in effectively as a replacement of Joe Brady, who's now the Buffalo Bills offensive coordinator. And he has had a similar trajectory and rise as a Joe Brady and everything. But the nice thing for a Declan Doyle is, like, that's Ben Johnson's offense. So Declan gets this really nice opportunity to sit back, learn from one of the best, well, maybe the best in the game right now when it comes to offensive systems, and then see where his future takes him. I think he's the thing that will stand out to you about Declan Doyle at 28 years old is how well he's going to connect to all of those players on offense. He does a really good job of building relationships with the players that he's around.
I assume everyone but Mercedes Lewis, who's like 15 years old.
Right.
15 years old, like, what is this kid trying to tell me to do as an offensive coordinator? Wait a minute. I think they should make him tight ends coach in the future. Mercedes Lewis. I think that'd be a fun transition.
There you go.
And then there have been swirling rumors at the time we're recording this. Nothing is official yet about the Bears potentially hiring the former Saints offensive line coach, whose name I still can't pronounce.
It's Dan Roushar.
Dan Roushar, who's currently the offensive line coach at Tulane. If that happens, I guess, generally speaking, how did you feel like the Saints offensive line was coached? Again, same kind of development question. Were they able to get guys better, or were they just plug and play in free agents and first-round picks?
Yeah, there's a lot of free agents and first-round picks, but I'll tell you this, like, the thing that he brings is, like, he teaches these guys to be physical and violent. Like, that's the type of play that he wants to be. He is very much a don't wait for them to come to you, go get them kind of coach at the offensive line where it's appropriate, right? When you're in a pass set, you're in a pass set, right? You're doing what you're doing. So within reason, everything like that. But that's the thing that I think you'll see with him if he is hired is kind of a tick up in the very physical nature in which that offensive line is asked to produce and play. And I think what you're going to see is a lot of hard-nosed coaching from him as opposed to a lot of, like, player coddling, right? It's a very different approach. He's kind of Doug Marrone-ish in that way.
One of those they had in Chicago last year, and one of them they're looking to get in Chicago this year. So that would be a nice change of pace. Ross, this is excellent. You're a treasure trove of Saints knowledge and football knowledge. Thank you so much for joining us. Give us a quick plug if people want more Saints coverage from you or want to check in on whatever's going on with your head coaching search. Is a contrast to what we've been experiencing. Let everybody know, where they can follow you, where they can find all your work.
Yeah, if you're interested in what's going on with the New Orleans Saints post Dennis Allen and what it's like to not have a team that has hired a head coach yet, you can come over and check out Locked On Saints. You can catch us over on Locked On NFL as well. Both Lauren and I both do that.
Did you do Thursdays?
I do Fridays.
Oh, Friday mornings.
Yeah.
Friday mornings with Tyler?
With Tyler.
Yes.
Yep. So always fun there. And you can find some written work over at LouisianaSports.net. You can find it all in one place on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson Nola, NOLA. Really appreciate you having me on.
Ross, appreciate it. Anytime we can do this in person, it's a lot of fun.
I know, it's great.
At the very least, I'll see you at Indy.
Yeah, right.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Thanks so much.
Of course, man.
Yeah. Thanks again to Ross Jackson from Locked On Saints for joining us on the podcast today here in person in Mobile, Alabama. If you enjoyed our conversation, if you learned something about Dennis Allen and this new Chicago Bears defense, make sure you hit the subscribe button to Locked On Bears on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. Hopefully every single day. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. If you're looking for a second listen, you can check out Ross Jackson on Locked On Saints. You can check out Ross Jackson on Locked On NFL. You can check out me on the Locked On NFL podcast as well. We cover the NFL twice a day with Tyler Rowland in the morning and Tony Wiggins in the afternoon, and a rotating cast of co-hosts from across the Locked On Podcast Network. We'll have more Bears coaching staff coverage for you, more NFL draft coverage for you, more free agency coverage for you. Next week on Locked On Bears, we'll still be here for you 5 days a week, all off-season long, so that each and every time you can get another opportunity to bear down.